tell you will make you question every hotel you've ever stayed in, because some rooms exist in places they shouldn't. And once you've slept there, you become part of their history forever. Last week, I checked into room 313 at the Marlowe Inn during a thunderstorm that forced me off the highway. But according to the hotel records, room 313 was destroyed in a fire 35 years ago. The problem is, I still have the room key in my pocket. It's covered in ash that wasn't there when I checked in. And every night since then, I've been receiving phone calls from a rotary phone that doesn't exist, in a room that shouldn't be there, from someone who died decades ago. What happened during those 8 hours I spent in that impossible room will haunt you. Because if it happened to me, it could happen to anyone who finds themselves traveling alone on a dark, stormy night. I was driving from Chicago to Denver when the storm hit with a violence I'd never experienced before. Lightning that seemed to crack the sky in half. Rain so heavy my wipers couldn't keep up, and fog so thick it felt like driving through a living thing that was trying to swallow my car whole. By 11:30 p.m., I couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead of me. So when I spotted the flickering neon sign of the Marlowe Inn through the murky darkness, I pulled into the gravel parking lot with immense relief. The building looked like it had been frozen in time since the 1950s, with Art Deco architecture and faded paint that gave it an eerie charm. But I was too exhausted and desperate for shelter to care about aesthetics. Inside the lobby, which smelled of old cigarettes and lemon cleaning solution, sat a desk clerk who looked like he'd been working there since the hotel opened. Ancient, wrinkled, with eyes so pale they seemed almost colorless. When I asked for a room, he slid a tarnished brass key across the worn wooden counter without looking up from his newspaper. And in a voice that sounded like gravel scraping against concrete, he said, "Room 313, end of the hall on the 3rd floor, and don't be surprised if you hear some noise tonight. Old buildings settle in strange ways." The elevator was one of those old-fashioned cage lifts that ground and shuddered with each floor, and when it finally reached the 3rd floor, stepped into a hallway that felt wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. The carpet was damp, despite the building being heated. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips that hung like dead skin, and the air had a metallic taste that reminded me of blood mixed with smoke. Room 313 was at the very end of the corridor. It's isolated from the other rooms by at least 50 feet, sitting under a single flickering light bulb that cast dancing shadows on the walls. When I inserted the key, the door swung open with a creak that echoed down the empty hallway, revealing a room that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. Faded floral wallpaper, a rotary phone on the nightstand, furniture that belonged in a museum, and heavy velvet curtains that blocked out any light from outside. The strangest thing was the smell. Beneath the expected mustiness was something else, something that reminded me of charcoal and melted plastic. But I was too tired to investigate and collapsed onto the creaky bed, still wearing my clothes. At exactly 1:13 a.m., I was jolted awake by the shrill ring of that rotary phone. And when I answered it with a groggy hello, a woman's voice whispered in a tone that made my blood freeze. "You shouldn't have come here. They told you not to come. Here, now, you'll never leave." I couldn't sleep after that phone call, so I spent the rest of the night pacing the room and staring out the window at the storm, which seemed to be getting worse rather than better, as if the weather itself was trying to keep me trapped in that place. When morning finally came, I packed my bags and went down to the front desk to check out and complain about the disturbing phone call. But the same elderly clerk was there, and when I mentioned room 313, his face went through a transformation that I'll never forget. Confusion, then recognition, then absolute terror. He asked me to repeat the room number 3 times, then pulled out a thick, leather-bound registry book and flipped through pages that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades, running his finger down column after column of room numbers while muttering under his breath. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes wide with fear and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Sir, we don't have a room 313. We never have had a room 313. That entire wing was destroyed in a fire in 1989. They killed 7 guests, and it's been sealed off ever since." I pulled out the brass key and placed it on the counter, watching as his face went completely white and his hands began to shake. And he told me that the key I was holding was identical to the ones they used before the fire, keys that were supposed to have been melted down and destroyed 35 years ago, along with everything else in that wing. Despite every rational thought in my head screaming at me to leave immediately, I had to see for myself what had happened to room 313. So that evening, I convinced the terrified desk clerk to let me explore the sealed wing by promising to call the local news station if he didn't cooperate. He led me through a maintenance door marked authorized personnel only and down a corridor that felt like entering a tomb. The air was still and cold. Our footsteps echoed strangely, and our flashlight beams revealed walls blackened by fire, damage in ceiling tiles that had melted and rehardened into grotesque shapes. We walked for what felt like miles through this burned-out maze until we reached what should have been the end of the hallway where room 313 would have been located. But instead of a door, there was just a wall covered with sheets of plywood that had been nailed up decades ago. The clerk was about to suggest we turn back when we both heard it, the unmistakable sound of a rotary phone ringing, muffled but definitely coming from behind that plywood wall. As we stood there in shocked silence, listening to that impossible ringing, the plywood sheets began to crack and splinter as if something was pushing against them from the other side. And when the boards finally gave way and crashed to the floor, we found ourselves staring into room 313, exactly as I had left it that morning, completely untouched by fire, as if the blaze had somehow skipped over this one room and left it preserved in its own pocket of reality. Against every survival instinct I first possessed, I stepped into that impossible room, while the desk clerk fled back down the hallway, his screams echoing behind him until they were swallowed by the unnatural silence that filled the space. The room looked exactly as I remembered it, but now I could see details I had missed in my exhausted state the night before. The wallpaper wasn't just faded. It was moving, shifting patterns that hurt to look at directly. The furniture cast shadows that didn't match their shapes. Dawn, the mirror above the dresser reflected not the room I was standing in, but a different version of the room, one where everything was charred and melted and covered in ash. The rotary phone on the nightstand was ringing continuously now, an old-fashioned metallic sound that seemed to come from inside my skull rather than from the device itself. And when I finally gathered the courage to pick up the receiver, a woman's voice was clearer than before. No longer a whisper, but a full conversation spoken in tones of desperate urgency. She told me her name was Margaret Walsh, that she had been staying in room 313 in March of 1989 when the fire started, that she had tried to escape, but the door wouldn't open and the windows wouldn't break, and that she had been making phone calls ever since, trying to warn people not to stay in the room that had become her eternal prison. As she spoke, I began to see her not clearly, but like a double exposure on an old photograph. It's a translucent figure in a nightgown standing by the window, her face streaked with tears, and her hands pressed against the glass in a futile attempt to break through to the outside world. Margaret explained that room 313 existed in a space between spaces. It was created by the intense trauma and fear experienced by the fire victims, a pocket dimension that occasionally connected itself to the real world through the hotel's registry system, trapping unsuspecting guests who happened to check in during the right atmospheric conditions. She told me that I wasn't the first person to stay in the room. Since the fire, there had been dozens of others over the years. Travelers who had checked in during storms or late at night when the barriers between realities were thin, and most of them had never found their way back to the real world. As she spoke, other figures began to appear in the room, shadowy outlines of people in night clothes, all of them guests who had been trapped in various rooms during the fire, all of them reaching out toward me with expressions of desperate hope, as if my presence might somehow be their ticket to freedom. The temperature in the room began to drop rapidly, frost forming on the windows and my breath visible in the air, while the walls started to shift between their normal appearance and their fire-damaged state, flickering back and forth like a television with a bad reception. Margaret's voice became more urgent as she explained that I had a choice. I could stay and join them in their eternal vigil, or I could try to leave, but leaving would require me to find the exact moment when the room reconnected with reality, a window that opened only briefly and unpredictably, and if I missed it, I would be trapped forever like the rest of them. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran toward the door, but it wouldn't open, the handle turning uselessly in my grip, while Margaret and the other spirits watched with expressions of sad understanding, as if they had seen this desperate flight attempt countless times before. The room began to transform around me, walls shifting between their normal state and the fire-damaged version, furniture appearing and disappearing, the ceiling sometimes showing water stains and sometimes showing burn marks that looked like reaching hands. I threw myself against the door repeatedly, screaming for help that I knew wouldn't come, until suddenly I heard the sound I had been hoping for, footsteps in the hallway outside. Heavy boots that belonged to someone real and alive. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and I heard a man's voice calling my name. It was a security guard who had been alerted by the desk clerk's panicked report, and he was trying to find room 313 to check on me. As his voice grew closer, I felt the room shudder around me like a house in an earthquake, and Margaret's voice called out one final warning. When you leave, don't look back, don't ever come back, and whatever you do, don't keep the key. The door suddenly burst open, revealing not the burned hallway I expected, but the normal hotel corridor with the security guard standing there with a confused expression, asking me what I was doing in a maintenance closet. I looked around and realized I was standing in a small storage room filled with cleaning supplies. No furniture, no wallpaper, no rotary phone, just concrete walls and industrial shelving. But in my hand was still the brass key to room 313, now covered in ash and warm to the touch. The security guard escorted me back to the lobby, where the desk clerk was waiting with paperwork showing that I had never checked into room 313, because no such room existed in their system. According to their records, I had been assigned room 237 on the second floor, a room I had never seen, but which showed evidence of recent occupation when we went to check it. My luggage was there, my clothes were in the drawers, and there was even a receipt on the nightstand showing that I had ordered room service the previous evening, though I had no memory of any of it. The hotel manager arrived shortly after and offered me a full refund, along with a confidentiality agreement, explaining that they occasionally had guests who experienced confusion due to the building's complicated layout and its history, and that it was in everyone's best interest to keep these incidents private. I signed the papers and took the refund, but I kept the key, partly because ask for it back, and partly because I needed proof that what I experienced had been real and not some kind of stress-induced hallucination. For weeks after returning home, I researched the Marlowe and fire of 1989, and I found newspaper articles that confirmed 7 people had died, including a woman named Margaret Walsh, who had been staying in room 313. But what the articles didn't mention was that her body was never found. She had simply vanished from her room, leaving behind only a melted rotary phone and a brass key that has somehow survived the flames. Every night since then, at exactly 1:13 a.m., my phone rings, and when I answer it, I hear Margaret's voice asking if I'm ready to come back, reminding me that checkout time was never completed, and warning me that room 313 is still waiting for her. My return, the key sits on my nightstand, still warm, still covered in ash that never wipes away. Sometimes I catch myself looking up hotels online, searching for the Marlowe Inn, wondering if I should go back and try to help Margaret and the others find peace. Have you ever stayed in a hotel room that felt like it didn't belong in the real world?